Pomej. The Dead Man on Alpha Centauri Ab. Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases, Episode 1, based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production. After Sherlock Holmes knew precisely where Dr. Watson would be at the time of the ship's arrival in orbit, namely in his cosy home, Daflon, the scientific director of Ultimo 1, was able to beam him directly from Earth onto the bridge using the adsorber ray. There, he stood before his abductors, rigid as a statue and bewildered. He was wearing his dark formal suit and bore a thoroughly baffled expression on his presently petrified countenance. "Welcome aboard the Ultimo 1, dear friend," greeted Holmes, who was once again wearing his brown suit over a white shirt with a broad, dark green tie made of finest brocade, and pointed to his two companions. "These are Captain Decker and First Officer Tornot, who command this splendid vessel." "Decker? Tornot?" Watson repeated as if in a trance. "And who am I?" "But, my dear friend, you are the universally beloved Dr. Watson. Whatever do you mean by such a question?" "I just wanted to make sure, as I thought I had stumbled into someone else's dream. But I'll remember that the taller one with blonde hair in gold uniform is the captain, and the shorter one in silver grey is the first officer. You mentioned a ship, Holmes, but I can neither hear the sound of the sea nor feel the familiar rocking I'm used to when aboard ships." "I must of course explain this to you, you ignorant fellow," Holmes began. "We find ourselves aboard what is known as a spaceship, capable of sailing between planets and through time." "Yes, reassure yourself with a look through our front window at your blue planet, Dr. Watson," suggested Decker, who was eyeing the new guest on board critically. Watson glanced nervously in the indicated direction, then directed the pupils of both his eyes back to Holmes. "Oh, and how does that work, if I may ask? You know our good old locomotives, which are essentially nothing more than steam engines, don't you?" Upon Watson's nod, he continued, "And this ship here is something similar, just without the steam." "So you can't really explain it then?" Watson sought to confirm. "Why should he explain it to you at great length? The main thing is that it works," said Tornot, already somewhat impatiently. "Did you bring anything with you, Dr. Watson?" He said sheepishly, before announcing with a puffed-up chest. "My facial features and a dash of English humour. Do I need to declare either of those at customs?" "No, of course not. I was thinking more along the lines of a clever book." "My good man, all my knowledge is in my head," claimed the doctor, demonstratively tapping his temple several times. "And besides, you have quite a peculiar way of barging into other people's lives and turning them completely upside down." "Come along, I'll show you to your cabin," Tornot announced with a sigh, leading the way to the express lift that connected the bridge to all decks of the Ultimo 1. The cabin in question was located on the upper deck in the private section of the ship, where, incidentally, the intergalactic law solicitors also held court. Sherlock Holmes followed behind Tornot and told the doctor about his latest success. "I have already solved several cases here, including the murder of Decker's predecessor. Let me guess, my dear Holmes, I bet it wasn't the butler." "No, that one's made of metal, called Elmer, and has no human dark sides," Holmes reassured him. Before entering the lift, Watson remarked naively, "I say, this cabin is far too small, has no windows, and what's more, it's completely unfurnished." No, Tornot corrected him. "This is just the lift, the small moving room that will take us to your cabin." "Oh, I see," Holmes whispered in his old friend's ear. "Don't be alarmed, Watson. Here the furniture obeys every command like little lapdogs. I'll certainly have to get used to that. I've never had a sofa that obeyed me before, only one that squeaked when I sat down on it." The doctor was visibly pleased with his assigned cabin, as it had a porthole through which he could look outside. Holmes pointed theatrically into the blackness of infinity. "All those lights we spy in the night sky are worlds of their own, just like ours." "How lovely," said Dr. Watson. "I wonder if they have plum pudding there too, like we do." Tornot rolled his eyes, unable to comprehend the banal question about sustenance with traditional foodstuffs, and said, "We have vending machines here with excellent finger food, which means we can eat it with our fingers without unnecessarily dirtying any dishes." "Strange customs," wondered Dr. Watson. "And what's on the menu of these food dispensers today?" Holmes quickly interjected, "Oh, I'm sure you'll find something to your liking." "I certainly hope so, because before I was inexplicably removed from our house in Baker Street and transferred here, my dear Holmes, I was about to ask our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, for a cup of tea and scones." "Really? Since you're wearing your fine going-out suit, I assumed you were planning to dine out." "To be precise, I was planning to visit Lady Wyndcastle, who always offers me her leftover sandwiches from the day before, and that's why I wanted to get a bite to eat from Mrs. Hudson first," explained the doctor. Tornot interjected, "In that case, we'd best head to one of the vending machines to satisfy your hunger for sustenance, so that you may better savour your appetite for adventure later on." On their way to said vending machine, the loudspeaker demanded the crew's attention. A radio message reached the ship from the future, and it said, "Attention! An urgent message through the Eternity Ultra Shortwave. To the crew of Ultimo 1, murder on Alpha Centauri Ab. For investigation purposes, orders are given to report there as soon as possible. End of transmission." Rather nervously, Tornot half turned away from his two guests. "Mr. Holmes, please continue to keep the doctor company. I must head to the bridge to learn more about our next mission." Hardly had the first officer rushed out of sight when the master detective began explaining to his friend, "You know, Watson, the people from the future are not much cleverer than our contemporaries. They still require my brilliant powers of logical deduction to solve murder cases." "Aha! And how did you know that a murder would occur on Alpha Centauri Ab? Have you now acquired the gift of second sight?" "I admit, I didn't know that. Actually, I wanted to travel to the past with you to solve the case of Lady Amy Robsart, Lord Robert Dudley's wife, in the year 1560. But naturally, I can, with your assistance, solve the case on Alpha Centauri Ab as well." "Have you been there before?" "No, not yet, but I'm certain I can quickly adapt to this alien world," said Holmes with his characteristic confidence. "And with my detective instincts, I can easily manage anywhere." "Let's hope so." Both stopped in front of the food dispenser, which Holmes already knew. "Well, Watson, here we are in front of one of these splendid food dispensers. Choose the chicken. It tastes just like our chickens back home." With a practiced finger, the detective made the selection for his friend, and immediately an appetizing sandwich appeared in the dispensing slot. Dr. Watson examined the finger food dispensed from the machine with some skepticism, sniffed it, and then looked at Holmes as if asking for permission. "Do eat up, dear Watson," he encouraged him with a wink. "Courage comes from the belly. Everything else is despair." "Yes, but who prepares the food in this little box? Lilliputians?" "That question is quite beside the point. The quality and taste of the food speak for themselves, my friend." "Have you already tried them all, Holmes?" Dr. Watson fidgeted nervously with his bow tie, which held together his snow-white shirt collar. "Certainly, I couldn't detect any problematic changes in my body afterwards. As always, trust my taste buds. Come on, be brave. Eat up, Watson. Food and drink keep body and soul together, as Socrates himself knew." "Ah yes, now I remember. That's the philosopher who had to drain the hemlock cup to its bitter dregs." "Really, Watson, you're acting like a maiden being led to the wrong groom. It's merely the simple act of consuming food. You are hungry, aren't you?" He mumbled after a hearty bite. He chewed slowly, and his tense facial features gradually returned to their previous, friendly-looking form. Holmes certainly didn't dare reveal to him what exactly was hidden in that food item disguised as chicken. On the bridge, Tornot did not hold back his disapproval of the new guest aboard. "Sir, may I have your attention for a moment? I find it doubly troublesome that we now have two people from the past on the Ultimo 1. This doctor has such a deficit in medical knowledge that he could never catch up in this lifetime. But he inspires our detective in his endeavours. Decker replied. And their archaic way of thinking is absolutely ideal for the archaic task that lies ahead of us. Namely, to solve the murder of a citizen of Alpha Centauri Ab. Sometimes we think far too elaborately in this regard. Well, the fact that he solved the murder of your predecessor, sir, and the other murders on board, was possible due to our still human nature. But how is Sherlock Holmes supposed to deal with aliens on a foreign planet? He'll reach his limits there, Tornot predicted. Shall we make a wager on that? Asked Decker, with that glint in his eyes he always got when he was quite certain about something. Yes, let's bet for a... Tornot pondered briefly before continuing. For a holiday on Mars. The bet is on. At that moment, Holmes and Watson came onto the bridge. Did I hear the word bet? Holmes inquired. As an Englishman, I'm practically predestined for such matters. What's it about, and what are the stakes? Mr. Holmes, Decker began, placing a hand jovially on his shoulder. This is between me and my first officer. You should focus solely on your upcoming difficult task. Rather haughtily, Holmes straightened his spine, drew himself up to his full height of 6 feet, and nodded slowly. Decker removed his hand from his shoulder and explained, What we know so far is rather limited. Excuse me, before you reveal what little knowledge you have, is there something like a wash basin where I can clean my hands? Your finger food has made them rather greasy, Dr. Watson asked timidly, raising his hand. Tornot, Decker instructed him. Take the doctor to one of our washrooms. Come with me, doctor. I'll show you to a room with running water where you can also attend to your personal needs, should you feel the urge. Tornot explained to him on the way to the lift. You must forgive Watson, as he hasn't the faintest idea what's coming his way. Holmes asked Decker to be considerate of his friend. I was able to adapt much more quickly. Just think how long I had to use my powers of persuasion before I could get him to try your food made from insects. I didn't even dare tell him where it actually comes from. Yes, I can imagine he would have been rather indignant, Decker said, amused. Meanwhile, Tornot and Dr. Watson had already reached a washroom, and the doctor was inspecting it thoroughly. This is absolutely amazing. May I sketch the plans so that I can have something like this installed in our house when I return? Of course, dear doctor, but first wash your little paws and... Please do not speak to me as if I were an idiot. Dr. Watson objected to this familiar tone. I do not appreciate that at all. Holmes has this habit from time to time as well. He becomes so full of himself that in his presence one sometimes feels transported back to childhood when he explains the world to you in such elaborate fashion. Yes, he's displayed that character trait towards us quite often too. And in Wet Room 12, he even smoked without permission, which immediately activated the sprinkler system, leaving him completely soaked from above, Tornot revealed to him. Since then, he's had the nickname Smoky Holmes. Ha, I would have loved to have seen that. Dr. Watson held his hands over the sink and became enraptured by the water pouring from the tap above. We've got it all on tape, but we'll show you another time, Tornot promised him. Meanwhile, Holmes was lecturing Decker again about the tools of a good detective. I owe the solution of numerous cases primarily to my powers of observation and my gift for logical thinking. Shall I tell you about another one from the recent past? No, thank you very much, Mr. Holmes. Decker quickly waved off and crossed one leg over the other as he sat proudly in his captain's command chair on the bridge. I'll be quite satisfied if you solve this current case as quickly as possible so that we can turn our attention to other matters. If you wish, I can also remain silent, Holmes conceded, slightly piqued. When Dr. Watson returned to the bridge with Tornot, he was positively bursting with enthusiasm about his newly gained insights into the ship's architecture. We should have such a splendid bathroom installed in Mrs. Hudson's house as well, Holmes. All right, my friend, he placated him. First, we must demonstrate our capabilities to these gentlemen. Finally, Decker could return to the reason for the upcoming mission. Back to the unpleasant murder. We're dealing with a male being on an Earth-like planet orbiting Alpha Centauri A, the fourth brightest star in the night sky, which is over 4 light years away. Cause of death? Unfortunately, still unknown. We shall now travel there through time and space. Tornot, full speed ahead. Full speed ahead, repeated Tornot, who entered the decisive sequence into the accelerator, whereupon a jolt went through the ship that nearly knocked the 2 guests off balance. The speed of the Ultimo 1 multiplied. The sound of a truly unpleasant squealing noise inside the ship swelled up, as if someone were scraping a many-pronged fork across glass. It thundered in their ears, and it took less than 2 minutes to travel 200 years into the future to reach their destination. "Steady on, old chap," escaped Dr. Watson. "Oh, I forgot, we're not using animals for transportation anymore." "Not even Pegasus, the winged horse from Greek mythology," joked Torno, who often tried to lighten the atmosphere on board with his witty remarks, though he had a tendency to put his foot in it from time to time. "Here we are," Decker said cheerfully, pointing through the windscreen. "That's the planet I mentioned where we can breathe without additional equipment." "What? We've already arrived on this alien planet that orbits a foreign sun far from Mother Earth? That was quicker than if we'd both trotted to Lady Alquist's by horse and carriage," Dr. Watson marvelled. "Those are indeed the advantages of modern times," Holmes said cheerfully. "I do hope there's no war on this planet," Dr. Watson worried. "As an army doctor, I've already witnessed quite enough suffering, both human and animal." "No, the planet Alpha Centauri Ab is an exceptionally peaceful world," Decker reassured him as he rose to his feet. "From your lips to God's ears," Dr. Watson hoped, "but your martial attire has quite a warlike quality about it." "Those are merely the symbols of his captain's honour," Tornot explained to him. "Commanding respect, that can never hurt when travelling between foreign planets." Dr. Watson seemed to have thought of something as he tapped his head and leaned towards his friend. "Holmes, if I've understood correctly, this remarkable spaceship can not only travel between planets, but also sail back and forth between different times, right?" "Yes, indeed, my friend. Incredible as it may seem," confirmed Holmes. "Couldn't we sail back to the time before the murder so that we can prevent it?" Holmes took a deep breath. "You once served as an army doctor in Afghanistan, so you ought to know what an order is, Watson, and that one must follow an order without any ifs, buts, or suggestions for improvement. The order was not to prevent the murder, but to solve it, a difference that should not be overlooked, I dare say." Watson nodded in agreement. "And for that, of course, one must first let it happen. At last, logic seems to have regained control of your brain," Holmes rejoiced, and turned to Tornot. "This absorber beam appears to have a somewhat thought-slowing effect." "No," Tornot objected. "It rather seems to be about the psyche, which must first come to terms with the fact of being lifted out of one's own time and finding one's feet far from home. At that moment, the lift door opened and Lura entered the bridge, a blonde beauty in a crimson mini-dress and yellow high-heeled boots, and moreover, with a sweet smile on her face that reminded one of the Mona Lisa's, though with slightly fuller lips. "Oh, good day, missa," Dr. Watson greeted her and was about to tip his hat, though he wasn't actually wearing one, as he hadn't been wearing it when he was abducted from the house in Baker Street. "Lura," she trilled, swaying her hips as she moved towards the captain. Holmes whispered to his baffled friend, "That's Lady Lura from accounting. Even in the future, everything on a journey must be accounted for and recorded, just as we know it, only a bit more modern, of course." Dr. Watson whispered back, somewhat embarrassed. "Is there a shortage of fabric in the future? The lady is wearing such an awfully short skirt. I can see her legs. Very beautiful, very long legs, if I may say so without sounding improper." "Control your carnal desires, Doctor," Holmes admonished him with professorial sternness. "This is future fashion. Instead, feast your eyes on her blonde hair, which falls in loose waves over her shoulders." "Yes, her wavy hairstyle is quite lovely. Nothing could stop me from rushing to her aid immediately should she require it." Sherlock Holmes winked at him. "Yes, indeed. There's still a noble knight in every man, including myself. In fact, one with a flaming sword. "Well, I hope you don't burn anyone with that," remarked Tornot, who had been devoutly eavesdropping on the pair. After the administrative matter was dealt with, Lura left the bridge, but not before casting a longing glance at Dr. Watson. "Did you see that, Holmes? The lady has taken quite a fancy to me." Yes, nothing escapes my notice." Encouraged by the young lady's intense gaze, Dr. Watson promptly inquired with Tornot, "Do you think I might have a chance with the lady, Mr. Tornot? Doctor, spare yourself the impending heartache, or you'll be depressed when you return to your time. Besides, she's involved with a colleague of yours, Dr. Z." "Yes, a portly fellow," remarked Holmes, who already knew Dr. Z. "Besides, beautiful women tend to be very demanding and rather expensive." "Why is he just called Z?" wondered Dr. Watson. "Time-saving," came Holmes's terse reply. "Right, enough of this private chatter," demanded the captain rather gruffly. "We're heading to the shuttle now and landing on Alpha Centauri Ab. Please follow me and Tornot." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "And who will hold the fort and be in command aboard during your absence?" "Our scientific director Dafflon, the chap in the white coat who was kind enough to bring your friend aboard using the adsorber beam." The journey to the flying disc in the cargo bay proceeded in silence. Holmes had already immersed himself in deep concentration, ready to begin his mental work immediately upon arrival. Dr. Watson was visibly uncomfortable, moving through the unfamiliar surroundings as if walking on thin ice. Even boarding the flying disc seemed like overcoming a hurdle for him, whilst Holmes was already conducting himself with his usual composure. He observed the flight to the planet, the crossing through its atmosphere and the gentle landing with satisfaction. Alpha Centauri Ab had dense urban development on one side, whilst on the other side there was still an undeveloped wasteland. It was precisely there where they disembarked and looked around curiously in the bright light of the alien sun. "Have you been here before, Mr. Decker?" Holmes inquired. "Yes, but that was quite a while ago. Since then, the development has progressed further. Over there you can see some rocks. If I've been correctly informed, we'll find the victim's body underneath them." "Ah, so it could have been a simple fall then?" Dr. Watson surmised. "No," replied Tornot. "Otherwise they would hardly have summoned us here." "There's a certain logic in that," Holmes admitted. Do you gentlemen have any weapons with you, in case we are attacked?" Dr. Watson inquired. "Yes, look here." Decker raised his right arm, on which he wore a black bracelet. "This is called a neutron bracelet, a simple mechanism. With your palm turned downwards and bent, you can reach and press the trigger at the lower end of the bracelet with your middle finger, whereupon a neutron beam immediately shoots out from the upper end, either killing the opponent or just severely wounding them, depending on where you aim. But what if one doesn't have a middle finger? I knew a Scottish angler who had his bitten off by a salmon. Exhaling, Decker explained to him. Then I'll quickly grow a new one using regeneration ointment. Well, that puts my mind somewhat at ease. Are there any wild animals around here? What you immediately think of, Doctor, Tornot said with amusement. There are only lizard-like olms here, though they only come out at night since it's too hot for them during the day. Speaking of hot, Holmes chimed in, I'd rather fancy taking a thirsty peek at the drinks cabinet if you happen to have one built into this marvellous flying wonder. I'm afraid we only have water from the hoses. Would you like another sip? Asked Decker. No, I'm not quite that thirsty. Together, they set out on the dusty path. It looked like Arizona on Earth, except the sky was a more intense blue, like velvet. During the flyover, one could make out a sort of Grand Canyon from above, though without any river running through it. As they wandered along, a pleasant breeze blew towards them, bringing a refreshing aspect to their mission. Oh, remarked Dr. Watson, pointing to the cloudless sky. They've got quite a bright moon here. Wrong again, Tornot grinned. That's Alpha Centauri A's companion star, namely the smaller Alpha Centauri B. Ah, rather like us, the doctor noticed. I am shorter than Holmes, and you are shorter than the captain. Yes, but mental stature matters too. What are you implying, Tornot? Decker shot him a nasty look. Just a joke, sir." Meanwhile, after a short march, the small group of four had reached the crime scene. Under a reddish-brown, bizarrely shaped rock lay a very, very slender, pale-skinned, bald figure on its stomach, wearing no top and clad in tight grey trousers. "Good Lord!" exclaimed Dr. Watson, clasping his hands together in horror. "The poor fellow is completely malnourished." "Ha ha ha ha," Tornote chuckled. "I feel rather awkward having to point out another misconception, but all the people here look like that. Rather small and delicate and hairless. How awkward that everyone is hairless, as my first suspicion would have been poisoning, which could have caused the victim's hair loss." Dr. Watson justified himself. "How long has the lifeless body been roasting under the sun?" Holmes inquired. Decker glanced at his wrist computer, which he wore on his left wrist. "For just under an hour. Nothing whatsoever has been altered here since then." Holmes examined the surroundings around the corpse closely and noted, "No footprints, no tyre tracks. The wind must have blown everything away by now. He appears to be completely unharmed on the outside. May we turn him over?" inquired Dr. Watson. "One moment," exclaimed Holmes, raising his index finger. "His shoulder blades are protruding as if they were trying to pierce through the skin and grow into wings." "Quite right," Decker praised. "Everyone here can fly. That's why it was rather unlikely that he fell from above. But look closely, Mr. Decker," Holmes insisted, pointing at the shoulder blades. "These were once wings at most. Someone appears to have clipped them. Now that you mention it, I notice it too. It appears that part of them has been professionally amputated," Decker admitted. "Most peculiar. Let's carefully turn him over, Watson," Holmes ordered, and, together with his friend, proceeded to turn over the dead man, who displayed a certain rigidity. "Oh, horror! What a terribly disfigured face!" "No, they all look like that around here," Decker informed him, whilst Tornote had a quiet chuckle to himself. "Almost like something from our human mythology, an evil troll or a nightmare from various old paintings. Although in the paintings from 1781 and 1800, these gloomy fellows most certainly had hair, indeed even possessed fur of their own," noted Dr. Watson, who rather enjoyed displaying his extensive knowledge. Holmes drew his magnifying glass from his inner left jacket pocket and noticed something unusual, which he immediately shared with the others. "In any case, there appears to be a distinct injury on the forehead." "Yes, it appears that way to me too," confirmed Decker, aiming his wristband at it. "With my handy weapon, I can also emit X-rays that will show us if there's a foreign object lodged inside the head." "What sort of rays are those with such a peculiar name?" Dr. Watson wanted to know. "They won't be discovered until 1895, so you couldn't know about them yet, dear doctor. And in England, they'll be called X-rays. But they show us the body from the inside as well," explained Decker, and activated the bracelet, which emitted the invisible rays and made the corpse transparent. "Indeed, there's a tiny tube lodged in the brain." Dr. Watson seemed absolutely thrilled by this discovery. "That's a standard memory strip," explained Tornote. "One can store all the world's knowledge on it and enhance it with personal experiences." "And can one see this knowledge?" Holmes wanted to know. "It must be absolutely tiny." "Yes, the bearer of such a memory strip can view the knowledge stored on it inside their head at any time. It's like reading a book that only you can see in your mind's eye." "Could it have been stolen from the dead person and replaced with another tiny piece that was exactly the same size?" "Yes, that's absolutely possible, Mr. Holmes," Decker commended. "I'll switch on the magnetic function on my bracelet and extract it so we can examine it aboard the shuttle." Done and dusted, Decker removed the memory strip, and they all made their way back to the flying saucer. "What will happen to the corpse now?" Dr. Watson wanted to know. "Will vultures come along at some point and play health inspector?" "No, there are no vultures here," Decker informed him. "Daflon, our scientific director and expert on nearly everything, will retrieve the body using the adsorption beam and examine it thoroughly during an autopsy." "Yes, even though the corpse doesn't have any hair," Tornote joked. But no one except him laughed at the weak joke. Inside the flying disc, the temperature was much more pleasant than outside in the desert landscape, and Holmes and Watson used the break to refresh themselves with clear water from the drinking tube of a console. Afterwards, Holmes used a handkerchief from his jacket to dust off his shoes, as he was, as always, very mindful of his impeccable appearance. Meanwhile, Decker had inserted the tape into the shuttle's display and pressed play. "Ha, we'll soon know who the murderer is," Tornot announced with absolute certainty. The memory strip played. Colourful images flashed by at breakneck speed, showing social life in the planet's urban areas with all its dainty inhabitants, who were chattering away in an incomprehensible language. "What are these strange people saying?" asked Dr. Watson. "Oh, the usual. They're complaining about the dreadful weather, the awful food, the lack of funds for daily living and increasing demands at work, and the ever-present problems in social interactions with relatives, neighbours, false friends, and backstabbing, bullying colleagues. In short, exactly like back home," Tornot explained. "Social interaction is a good keyword, Mr. Tornot. Did the deceased specifically complain about any of his fellow citizens?" inquired Sherlock Holmes with narrowed eyes. Now Tornot pulled a rather helpless face. Aha! Dr. Watson gloated mischievously. "This time you were wrong, weren't you, my friend? The deceased didn't leave any clue about his murderer, not the slightest." "Well, I'm afraid I wasn't able to delve into all the details that emerged from the rather incomprehensible droning in what was, for me, quite a foreign language," Tornot reluctantly admitted. "We would surely only need to listen to the last sentences that the dead man and his fellow citizens uttered," Holmes suggested. "Well, unfortunately, those were deleted," Decker admitted with a crestfallen expression. "The last bit of the tape is covered in utter emptiness. It would have been far too easy otherwise. They wouldn't have had to ferry us all the way here for that. To be fair, they should have informed us about this, and we ought to complain that they didn't tell us about the deletion straight away," Tornot criticised. "That's rather suspicious," said Holmes. "After all, who but the perpetrator would play such a foolish game with us?" "Quite right," Dr. Watson now realised. "The perpetrator is only letting his hunters know the bare essentials and not a word more." "The message came from the Vice President of the planet," Decker recalled. "Oh dear, a politician," Dr. Watson dismissed. "Complaining about someone like that usually gets you absolutely nowhere. The scoundrel who did all this should be hanged by the neck until dead," Holmes said indignantly. "We don't do that sort of thing nowadays," explained Tornot, "as it's far too barbaric. Instead, we either send the offender for physical dissolution in the particle accelerator." Here, Holmes interrupted knowingly. "There's no need to accomplish everything with this newfangled technology. Good old-fashioned manual labour still serves its purpose. Let's not put the hangman out of work. Or one sends him to a different time," Decker completed his first officer's unfinished sentence. "Which other time period?" Dr. Watson wanted to know. "According to the prosecutor's preference. Most prefer the Middle Ages. A select few choose the Stone Age, and some others opt for our 21st century, which was rocked by various crises and continuously produced new doomsday prophets and virus deniers." "Outrageous! Every planet should keep their own criminals," Dr. Watson said irritably. "That's easier said than done," Tornot objected. "Since we're in a galactic union, we have to accept, like it or not, that such things unfortunately come with certain drawbacks. Or do you know of anything that only has advantages?" "Indeed," claimed Dr. Watson. "Oh, really? And what might that be?" "But that's completely obvious. I'm surprised you even need to ask." Dr. Watson worked himself up, while frantically trying to think what on earth this thing could be that he had so boastfully announced. "I'm sorry, but I can't quite put my finger on it at the moment. It might be due to the planet's slower rotation around its sun, or its somewhat thinner atmosphere, or perhaps the unusual circumstances of having to endure being cooped up in a small flying disc with two people from 3 centuries ago," Tornot said irritably. "Tornot, don't," Decker warned him. "So, what exactly is this matter you're referring to, Dr. Watson?" Tornot insisted on an answer. Do you really want to know? Dr. Watson stalled for more time to think. Yes, I should think so. When I ask a question, I generally expect an answer. Very well then, I shall tell you. What were we talking about again? Decker interjected, having briefly lost track of the conversation. Tornot enlightened him. About the fact that good Dr. Watson claims he knows something that only offers advantages. Ah, yes, I'd be quite keen to hear about that too, Decker admitted. Dr. Watson took a deep breath and revealed to them what had occurred to him in the meantime. It's the belief in God, gentlemen. Indeed, those who believe in God are well off, as they can hope for invisible support. And regardless of whether they receive it or not, it also works as a placebo effect. Tornot and Captain Decker looked at each other helplessly, as both were more inclined to believe in science and couldn't quite warm to matters of faith. Yes, there's some truth in that, Doctor, Tornot finally agreed, albeit reluctantly, after a brief moment of reflection. There you have it. Dr. Watson looked triumphantly at Holmes, who acknowledged his victory in this dispute with a brief nod. Now that this important point has been settled, Decker spoke up again, we should return to the matter that actually brought us here, gentlemen. I suggest we go and have a word with the Vice President, said Holmes. Nobody's praying here, remarked Tornot, who had missed the joke in this expression. There's no profession of faith here. Well, such an outrage doesn't surprise me then, Dr. Watson said irritably. Godless creatures have no morals either. I must disagree with that, Decker objected. There hasn't been a murder here for centuries. On the other hand, back on Earth, despite belief in God, crimes were being committed non-stop. Yes, but only by godless people, Dr. Watson defended his stance on the matter. And anyway, I think... Sherlock Holmes interrupted him brusquely. My dear Watson, while I do appreciate your comprehensive plea, it is entirely inappropriate here. Well, if you say so. Right then, let's fly to the presidential palace, where the Vice President also holds court. His name, by the way, is Maleki Debris, Decker informed them. Rather odd name, Dr. Watson chided. But names are mere sound and fury, signifying nothing. It would certainly be advantageous if we could already report the cause of death, Tornot interjected. We can pin him down on the motive as well. Holmes waved off with a casual gesture. Don't worry, I can easily draw him into a conversation where he'll contradict himself, and then we'll have him. But Holmes, you don't even understand the language here, Dr. Watson reminded him. You're not wrong there, my dear friend. However, I've often found that I can pick up new subject matter rather quickly. Do you happen to have a dictionary here, Mr. Decker? I can retrieve translations for simple questions on the display. Watch this, Mr. Holmes. He immediately tapped on the touchpad display and a litany in the indigenous language rang out. Ljasolfulve Øystreid voxtimölastem. And what does that mean? Inquired Dr. Watson. Hello, how are you? Thank you. I'm quite well, said the doctor with a smile. How kind of you to finally inquire after my well-being. No, the sentence we just heard means, hello, how are you? Tornot burst out laughing, whilst Dr. Watson's complexion changed from rosy to red with rage. Really, Mr. Tornot, such gloating behaviour is most unbecoming towards a guest from the past, he said indignantly, and didn't utter another word for the remainder of the flight. The 4-person delegation from Earth was received with full honours in the magnificent presidential palace. They had evidently spared no expense or effort, laying out a buffet of delicacies. On a 3-metre-long table, roasted and grilled fish were arranged on glass platters, alongside apples and filleted cave salamanders. Well, at least I'm properly dressed, Dr. Watson declared while straightening his bow tie. A gentleman remains a gentleman, remarked Holmes whilst eyeing the delicacies on offer. Decker immediately grabbed a juicy apple. Where does an apple tree grow around here? Holmes asked with interest. In the course of diplomatic relations, our eager government representatives presented some gifts to their guests, explained Decker, taking a hearty bite. And Tornot said to Dr. Watson, An apple a day keeps the doctor away. The citizens present, a group of male and female beings, were uniformly dressed in grey. Both men and women wore tight-fitting shirts and trousers, whilst the ladies also wore dark-haired pageboy wigs. "Liasold fulve oistrayed voxgem olasdem," said Sherlock Holmes by way of greeting, and received a friendly nod from all those present. Then he quietly informed Decker. The few minutes of the flight weren't enough to learn more of the language. "No worries," Tornot reassured him. "They have interpreters here as well." Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted, causing Holmes and Dr. Watson to think of the trumpets of Jericho, immediately ceasing their feasting and looking around vigilantly. However, it was merely the fanfare announcing the entrance of Vice President Maleki Debris, and his appearance caused sheer amazement on the faces of the four visitors. Maleki Debris looked exactly like the Egyptian god Thoth, who was always depicted on pyramids as an ibis-headed figure. Apparently, he was a genetic experiment that had once walked on Earth during the time of the ancient Egyptians. The second surprise was that the Vice President, who towered over his delicate people, was proficient in English and greeted his guests warmly and, above all, intelligibly. "Thank you very much for coming, noble gentlemen from Earth. We greatly appreciate your efforts. I kindly ask you to excuse the absence of our highly esteemed President Mascalara Umbrazi. He is currently on an exploratory flight to Alpha Centauri Ad, an as yet unsettled planet in this system, which is to be colonized in the near future." The Vice President spread his arms in a welcoming gesture, which appeared quite ceremonial in his royal blue robe that harmonized beautifully with the colour of his feathers on his head. "Delighted to make your acquaintance. My name is Captain Decker, this is my first officer Tornot, and our guests Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Thank you very much for your hospitality. May I ask straight away why you are wearing a mask, Honourable Vice President?" Dr. Watson wanted to know. "Masked?" The Vice President almost let his beak droop, so deeply wounded was he by this question. Tornot quickly gave the doctor a gentle nudge in the ribs. "Shush! That's not a mask. He really looks like that." "But that's utterly impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Holmes lectured him. "After all, we flew here from Earth, which our contemporaries considered impossible, yet here we are, without a doubt." Pardon, Mr. Vice President, but I have never before in my life seen such a such a marvellous being as yourself." Dr. Watson apologised, rather contritely. "What have you discovered so far, Captain Decker?" probed the Vice President, barely acknowledging Dr. Watson. "That the last part of the murder victim's memory strip was erased." "Then we can assume the murderer has done a thorough job," Maleki Debris stated. "May I ask whether the deceased had any enemies?" Holmes spoke up. "Yes, you may ask. No, he had no enemies. That's why I requested an investigation by people who could approach the case impartially from the outside, without prejudice or regard for status. I'm afraid you'll have to excuse me now. I have important diplomatic matters to attend to." With that, the Vice President swiftly withdrew from the festival delegation. "Did you notice it too?" Holmes turned to Decker with a question. "I only noticed how curt that affected fellow was. Or what exactly do you mean, Mr. Holmes?" "That the Vice President had a small bloodstain on his beak." Sherlock Holmes pointed to his own characteristic nose, to the same spot where the stain had been on the suspect's beak. "I must admit that escaped my notice," the captain reluctantly conceded. "And what do you deduce from that, Mr. Holmes?" "Quite simply, that he must have stuck his beak into a bloody affair, into the victim's body, to be precise, for whatever reason. Perhaps that's the custom around here. But that could also be the remains of a meal," Tornot reckoned. "The Alpha Centaurians are carnivores just like us. As far as I know, they're quite partial to raw meat." "I'm rather inclined to believe Holmes," Dr. Watson chimed in. "He usually has a nose for these things. Why should it be any different here and now?" "Yes, but isn't that a bit too simple?" objected Tornot, who was more accustomed to complex processes, problems and approaches to solutions from his duties aboard the Ultimo One. Sherlock Holmes cast him a devastating look, as he dared to doubt his judgment. When the murderer feels secure and underestimates the detective, it can indeed be quite simple for the latter. You've seen this vain birdman yourself. It was, at least for me, rather obvious to recognize clear arrogance, hunger for power, and accompanying malicious intent behind his affected friendliness. Tornot visibly deflated and said meekly, "To be honest, I thought Maleki Debris' behaviour was merely an attempt to show off a bit during his boss's absence and to put on airs in front of us." "That rather corresponds to your own nature, my friend," Holmes assessed, having observed the interaction between him and the spaceship's captain for quite some time. "You also tend to show off a bit whenever your superior is not around." "Ouch!" Tornot hissed a sound of disapproval through his closed mouth. "We need a swab of the blood from the Vice President's beak," Decker realised, and pulled a cotton swab from the left breast pocket of his gold-gleaming uniform. "Under what pretext could we possibly run this swab across his beak?" "That's quite simple," said Dr. Watson. "We'll sell it to him as a new medical treatment for some illness or other." "That's exactly what I was about to suggest," claimed Holmes. "We could convince him that we've found traces of a previously unknown pathogen on the planet, therefore making it necessary to have his face, in his case, his beak, wiped with the swab." "That's absolutely brilliant," Decker rejoiced. "I'll quickly chase after the bird. If I'm not back in a few minutes, you'll need to pursue me." He immediately rushed off at speed in the direction Maleki Debris had disappeared. While Tornot, Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes were delighting in the offered delicacies, except for the filleted alms. Decker caught up with the Vice President just before his departure on the palace terrace. "Mr. Vice President, a word of importance," he began. "I was so excited to finally meet you in person that I completely forgot to relay rather unpleasant news of considerable significance." "Oh? What's happened then? A wandering black hole or a threatening supernova or an approaching comet?" "No, not quite that bad. Just a microscopic pathogen of the all-wider Nermit disease that threatens to spread across your wonderful planet." "I've never heard of that disease." "Well, my dear fellow, it spreads faster than its reputation." Decker improvised and pulled out the cotton swab. "Fortunately, we always carry the appropriate cure with us. If I may quickly dab you with this anti-pathogen swab, you can be certain you won't fall ill." Before the surprised Vice President could say anything, Decker dabbed around his beak with the cotton swab, precisely where he now also discovered the bloodstain that Holmes had spotted before him. "There, all done. Best of luck on your upcoming diplomatic trip, Mr. President." Decker turned elegantly to leave and left the slightly bewildered Ibis gentleman standing alone on the terrace. Back with the others, he showed off his success. "Here, I've got the blood on the swab. Now carefully stow it in my sterile uniform side pocket. Done, and we can take off." "Already?" Dr. Watson showed his disappointment. "I thought I could have one more dance with one of the female residents." "Nobody dances here. At most, they fight over the last piece of Ulm," Tornot whispered to him. On the bridge of the Ultimo 1, besides Decker and Tornot, Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson and Daflon, the scientific director who had already performed the autopsy and analysed the DNA trace on the cotton swab, had gathered. "The DNA on your cotton swab showed a 100% match with that of the deceased in my cold chamber, sir." "Thank you, Daflon. You're always reliable, working quickly and precisely," Decker praised him. "And what are the autopsy results?" Daflon reported with a proudly puffed chest. The wings were amputated from the deceased whilst he was still alive, years ago, presumably due to a malfunction, as the musculature that controls wing movement is, unfortunately, underdeveloped. "Has he not got any internal injuries?" Dr. Watson wanted to know. "Yes, there is a small abrasion visible inside the throat." "Interesting, Daflon," said Holmes whilst massaging his chin. "Could this abrasion have been caused by a narrow beak?" "Quite possible. I thought as much. And what, my dear fellow, led to the unfortunate man's death?" "Well, Mr. Holmes," Daflon shrugged his shoulders. "Unfortunately, A direct cause of death cannot be determined, or can no longer be determined. If poison was used, it is no longer detectable, or perhaps never was. As far as I can tell from his background, which I had transmitted from the planet's administration, the deceased was a completely insignificant citizen named Immeral Undog. Nobody gained any advantage from his demise. Aha! Holmes announced his moment of realization. This could mean that someone merely wanted to test a poison or whatever method of murder on this unfortunate Immeral Undog, which would in turn suggest that the actual murder of someone whose death would benefit the killer is yet to come. Let me guess, Dr. Watson chimed in. You suspect our Birdman, am I right? Indeed. Holmes nodded and raised his eyebrows. His vanity is fed by the hubris of power. Such vain peacocks believe they can get away with anything in their climb to the top. Then we should try to stop his high-flying ambitions, suggested Dr. Watson. Holmes continued. And, above all, they want to reach the pinnacle of society, which would mean that the president would soon be pushed out of office and position, dead or alive, by his vice president. Are you certain that Maleki Debris is planning the coup d'etat and will simply bump off his superior? Asked Tornot, glancing at Decker as if contemplating a mutiny on board himself. Well, I have absolutely no doubt about this matter anymore. Holmes emphasized his thoughts with a confident gesture. Not the slightest doubt, gentlemen. Really, your archaic way of thinking is absolutely perfect for this archaic way of murder, Tornot remarked, giving the master detective an appreciative pat on the shoulder. The only remaining question is how we should prove the conspiracy. Holmes pondered, whilst pacing up and down the bridge with a meaningful expression. I rather think that won't be necessary. It will suffice to simply present our findings and your astute assessment to Parliament, said Decker, tapping the display in front of him. Attention! Report to the Parliament of Alpha Centauri Ab. We, the crew of Ultimo 1, thanks to the logical deductive abilities of our guest Sherlock Holmes, a world-famous detective in his time, and his assistant Dr. Watson, a successful military physician in his time, have reached the following investigative conclusion. The murdered Immeral Undog unwillingly served as a test subject for a new method of murder. Traces of injury from a narrow beak, similar to the one Vice President Maleki Debris bears in the middle of his face, were found in his throat. An examination of a swab that I, Captain Decker, personally took from a blood stain on his beak showed a DNA match with the murdered victim. This raises the urgent suspicion of another impending crime, in which the suspect, Maleki Debris, will dispatch the president in the same manner as the already murdered victim, in order to advance from his position as vice president to the highest office of state. End report. We hope this has been of service to you and wish you all the best for the future. Captain Decker, Stardate 320-8. The 8. Congratulations, sir, Tornot applauded frenetically. You've got what it takes to be a statesman. Holmes and Watson exchanged meaningful glances, and Holmes also cleared his throat audibly. Daflon joined in the applause sporadically and added, Given this favourable opportunity, I should like to request a pay rise, sir. Very well, Decker agreed magnanimously. Such claims should be submitted to accounting as usual, and I shall naturally verify the amount and give my official approval as a precaution. With a triumphant expression, Daflon left the bridge, whilst rubbing his hands together in anticipation of the joy to come. Dr. Watson whispered to his friend Holmes, What about our financial claims, Holmes? Unfortunately, the money of the future isn't valid in our time, he knew. But we could request a chunk of gold from accounting. Very good, Holmes, Dr. Watson said with delight. Gold will always retain its value, no matter what may come. At that moment, a high-pitched voice came through the ship's intercom. This is the Chief Justice of Alpha Centauri Ab speaking. We have received your message, and thank you and your crew for the swift and effective resolution of the treacherous murder of one of our citizens, Captain Decker. We have reached the following verdict for the murderer Maleki Debris. What? There's already a verdict? And so quickly? Dr. Watson asked himself, completely perplexed. When I think of our judicial system with judges in wigs and all the appeals from crafty defence lawyers and vindictive prosecutors, the wheels of justice certainly turn much more slowly. Time flows differently here than back home, Holmes explained to him. People here simply don't have as much time as we do back home. Or perhaps they use it more efficiently and with more enjoyment. Tornot couldn't resist making a witty remark once again. The voice from the loudspeaker solemnly announced, "We, the Senate of Alpha Centauri Ab, by virtue of our office and the evidence you have provided, hereby sentence Maleki Debris for high treason and murder to immediate forced relocation to ancient Egypt on Earth around 3000 before the start of your calendar. Thank you for your valuable assistance. Should the need arise, we remain at your disposal for reciprocal services. Have a safe journey home." "Well, they could have shown their gratitude differently," Tornot complained with visible disappointment on his face. "For instance, they could have presented us with a bar of platinum." "Or a chunk of gold," Dr. Watson chimed in. "Speaking of gold, what about getting paid in that form ourselves?" Tornot squinted at him disapprovingly. "Submit a formal request to our accounts department." "Very good, splendid," Dr. Watson exclaimed enthusiastically. "Then I can take this convenient opportunity to visit the charming Lady Lura and admire her beautiful legs." He wanted to rush to the lift, but Holmes held him back by the tail of his suit jacket. "Composure, dear friend. We are distinguished gentlemen, are we not?" "Yes, perhaps you are," grumbled Dr. Watson, pursing his lips into a sulking pout. Decker leaned back relaxedly in his captain's command chair, folded his hands behind his head, and noted with satisfaction, "Well, Tornot, I have undoubtedly won our bet, and at the same time I have a distinct feeling that our cantankerous vice-president will make it to godhood in ancient Egypt." "And that wouldn't be the first time," said Holmes dejectedly, "that an incompetent politician gets promoted." You are listening to Pomej, The Dead Man on Alpha Centauri Ab. Sherlock Holmes, The Galactic Cases, Episode 1, based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production.